So, in my previous videos, I attempted to establish the idea that based on the actual definitions instead of made up modern definitions, Trump definitely is not a National Socialist nor a fascist. The Project 2025 documentation doesn't fall into those definitions, and the Republican Party itself doesn't. So, at the very least, Trump must be a conservative, right? Well, unlike the other two videos where I'm trying to redefine words back to their original meaning rather than the corruption that's been placed upon them, conservatism is a much more difficult issue to deal with because it's harder to define, because its true definition is incredibly narrow and it's never really been construed that way in our system in the most narrow sense. Uh, Conservatism in the United States is at best nebulous patchwork. Now, to look at the actual root of conservatism, the idea is that you have particular sets of values that you are attempting to preserve or minimize the decay of them. Uh, in the true meaning of the definition, you're not actually trying to go backwards to something because that's being reactionary or that's reactionaryism. So, with conservatism in the United States, where it comes about is the GOP essentially became the hangout for everybody who didn't fit in the Democratic Party. And ultimately, lots of different groups ended up in there. So, although there's many different ways to be a conservative, you only have to extol the merest thread of that patchwork to be considered part of the conservative group. So you don't have, so if there were 10 planks of conservatism and you only adhered to one, you'd be a conservative. Kind of like the one drop rule of conservatism. Now, until recently, and we don't know how this is going to play out yet because it's literally in progress as we speak. However, until very recently, the nexus of control of the GOP was progressive. It still may be. We'll have a better understanding of that as we get to and through the election. This is confusing to people, but you have to remember that the first party progressivism appeared in was the GOP. Our people who vaunt Teddy Roosevelt don't understand that he was actually a progressive, a harbinger of much worse things to come. Now, the GOP progressives uh, are kind of viewed as the elder statesmen, the adults. And in all honesty, they actually have more in common with Democratic progressives than their own party. And to be clear, the Democratic Party is controlled by progressives, but they're not made solely of progressives. Now, conservatives are possibly a small majority of the GOP. However, they are never a majority in the leadership because essentially they're too fragmented to be an effective force. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of conservatives and then basically kind of go back and talk about how this fits into Trump and maybe provide a few examples of some of the people who fit these areas. Now, it's possible if there's these different types of conservatism to be in multiple camps at the same time. But as I said before, it's not necessary to be uh, in all the areas of conservatism. Merely adhering to one or claiming to adhere to one gives you the moniker of being a conservative. Now, sometimes the progressives of the GOP get confused to be conservatives. Mitt Romney is a really good example of this. Uh, what differs from the primary difference between Republican progressivism and Democratic progressivism is the idea of speed. Democrats, essentially, their progressives believe full speed ahead, that they're fully confident that progressivism is going to deliver a perfect result at some point. Whereas the GOP progressives, although they believe that progressivism will prevail and they're in favor of it prevailing, they think it needs to be implemented at a slower speed in order to look at the effects it's having and mitigate them, and also so it doesn't destabilize the country. So they're not against most of what Democratic progressives are. They're only against the speed at which it's being done. All right, so one of our first areas of conservatism is fiscal conservatism. And the fun part is to be a fiscal conservative, there's also different gradients of fiscal conservatism. Some members of the GOP are fiscal conservatives in name only. They talk about cutting government and reducing things and eliminating things, but their votes never match that. And the only time they actually vote for the reduction of government is when they're absolutely sure that it won't override a veto. We've seen this example with Obamacare. The Republicans voted a dozen times to repeal Obamacare while Obama was president, and each time it was vetoed. And then the one time they could have potentially passed it with Trump as president, they all caved in and fled. There's other types of physical conservatism, and I am trying to say fiscal. Pardon me if I keep throwing an extra syllable in there. Uh, they're the sustainable growth Republicans, who believe that the government, it's okay if it grows, but it needs to grow at a level that doesn't swamp the growth of the economy. Some conservatives are okay with cutting programs only if they have leftist values. So, therefore, if something has a conservative value, they're all in favor of spending, filling out the expenditure fully without any problems with it. Then there's freeze advocates, and some of these are actually okay guys. They're more pragmatists. Their idea is freeze the growth of government and let the economy grow to eventually increase the amount of money coming into the government so that the debt can start being paid and we can eventually balance the budget. Not all of them, but some of them are okay. And then there is the quote, smaller government conservatives. And this is a term that you'll basically see in virtually every bit of campaign literature coming out of most GOP campaigns, but it's literally a meaningless term. What does smaller government mean? So if you brought in a room full of Republicans and said, okay, you're all on truth serum, you can't lie, we're going to sit down and decide to eliminate one small piece of government. We're going to eliminate one little bureau and make it go away. We're going to take some handful of spending lines on the budget and get rid of them. They will not be able to come to a conclusive idea of what to do, because there's always going to be a handful that, oh, wait a minute, that particular one has an office in my district and that's jobs. So this smaller government idea never works. I like to throw out the idea of the FBI example. Okay, let's say somehow some miracle happens and you had libertarians in control of the government, federal government specifically. And let's say we put a proposal in front of them saying, let's eliminate the FBI. I can guarantee you an overwhelming majority, somewhere in the 75 to 90 percentile of that group, would advocate for complete elimination. The remainder would look for something that was so different you wouldn't even recognize it as the organization we have now. If you did the same thing with a group of Republicans saying, hey, let's eliminate the FBI, I guarantee you, you will not be able to get even the slightest majority to agree. You'll not even get a plurality to agree. You'll be lucky to get a majority willing to even cut their spending by some certain amount. Because they'll definitely come to the conclusion, well, yeah, we need it. And, if we get rid of those FBI agents, we'll just be at the mercy of all these other foreign countries. So we need to reform the FBI. And that's the general problem with the smaller government crowd. And ultimately, it comes down to, and this is the primary fault in conservatism, there is no theory of governance in conservatism. They don't ask the question, what is the job of government? And when they have that question, create the answer. So let's walk that back and say, okay, how does Trump compare to this? Well, at least based on what we saw in his first term, he's not a fiscal conservative. Government growth was massive at that time. Now, he may have been bamboozled by his advisors. He may have been convinced that because of the huge problems with the flu that broke out during that time period, that excessive spending was absolutely required. But at this point in time, we are not seeing anything but rhetoric to the idea that there's some kind of theory behind what Trump thinks government should be doing. And without a theory of governance, it's really hard to come up with spending cuts. It's very hard to make government smaller. I really hope that if he gets elected, I am completely wrong, and it turns out that yes, they are actually going to at least start moving the government towards some form of solvency. But past doesn't show that's going to happen. Okay, so then there's social conservatism. And again, this kind of breaks down into different groups. There are what I would call middle America values, where if you had some way of like averaging the ideas of what values Americans hold, middle American values would fall into this. Some social conservatives fall into that area. Some of the social conservatives are extolling religious values, and some of them actually believe what they're saying. I wish I could remember the guy's name. It was kind of funny, where this guy was, Christian values, blah blah blah, and I believe he was running for Congress. I don't know if he made it, and he was going on and on and on about you know the criticality of Christian values, and some reporter asked him, name the Ten Commandments. He couldn't, which is kind of funny. I mean, if that's going to be your shtick, you'd think you could at least memorize the Ten Commandments. Like, I grew up a Catholic and I can name the Ten Commandments. So religious values are rather problematic because uh, the different types of Christians within America. I mean, there's obviously core values that all Christians hold true, but there's also a spectrum of that where there's things they don't agree on. Uh, And I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing, because that's why we have different groups of Christianity, is because at some point they came up with core values where they said, hey, we're not quite the same as the group we're within. We need to break off and form this other group. So it's not a belittling, it's just a truism. So there isn't always full agreement on uh, the religious values of social conservatism. So bring this back to Trump. Does Trump have Christian religious values? I would lean against that. I don't think he was brought up that way. Does he have middle American values? I'm not sure, but I do. It's very clear that politically he is backing that. That is essentially the core of what he's aiming at, is to lock onto middle America values and use that as a try to create a core constituency out of that. Um, how much he believes this, we'll have to see if he's elected, what happens in the next term. I'm I'm willing to believe that's a possibility in terms of like the whole middle American values things. Religious values, I find dubious that he falls under that. So another form of conservatism is constitutional conservatives. These are people who basically extol the Constitution as a key document. With constitutional conservatism, we still run into problem that there are different schools of thoughts. Just for instance, um, there's originalism versus incorporation. Uh, a true originalist doesn't believe that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. Incorporation is the process where the Supreme Court declares the Bill of Rights uh, applying to the states bit by bit. And there's a good solid 8 to 10 different schools of constitutional thought that are all underneath the conservative umbrella. But if you look at just that difference there, one group believing that Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states because of originalism, and another group believing it does because of incorporation. That's a pretty vast difference. And then you have a lot of constitutional conservatives who are kind of fluffy on what's going on in the rest of the document, but are Bill of Rights advocates. Some of this again is in name only. They know they have to say what a great Second Amendment supporter they are, whether they actually understand the full reach of what that means. But most conservatives tend to fall around being Bill of Rights advocates rather than whole Constitution advocates. Some of this is marketing, and the Bill of Rights is a lot easier to market than the rest of the Constitution. And a lot of it comes down to politics of convenience. If you're going to run under the Republican banner, the easiest thing to do is say, I'm the most pro Constitution person in the world. And you probably run into some of the same problems if you hit some of these guys up, like the Christian who couldn't name the Ten Commandments. Probably a lot of these guys couldn't name the Ten Amendments to the Bill of Rights. So back to Trump. Is Trump a constitutional conservative? No, sorry, he's not. A lot of what he says indicates a certain level of ignorance of the Constitution, or if not ignorance, a lack of, he doesn't particularly care about it, or at least that's what his rhetoric would indicate. His last term, he made several moves that were essentially against the Second Amendment, and clearly didn't understand what the impact was. And we do hear him occasionally say things that are questionable in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of free speech, like wanting to ratchet down on libel laws, uh, hinting that there's certain people, certain people who shouldn't be able to. I'm not gonna. No, sorry. That may not. That's probably too far to say. Sorry about that. But I do think he's squishy on the Constitution at best. So he's definitely not a constitutional conservative. Now, the other type of conservative is either what we call the neocons or military conservatives. And essentially, neocons are just much more aggressive neoliberals. This group of people, for the most part, there is no war that they don't back. They don't care who's sitting in office. They'll basically sign any authorization that lets the president move troops wherever he wants. They'll happily raise the budget for the military without considering the idea that maybe the money is already there, but just being wasted. These types of conservatives may not be truly neoliberal in the sense that they understand the big picture. They may be essentially useful idiots to the neoliberals. One of the key things of the neocons or military conservatives, and they're different things, to be clear, no matter how else they feel about other things, they believe that somehow money that's run through the military becomes sanctified. So even if they're a hawk on everything else in terms of like a deficit hawk, trying to keep the budget in check, most of them, when you say, well, let's spend it on the military, they'll literally take any cut you pull and happily throw it right back into the military. And I'd say Trump most likely is not this type of conservative either. He seems to believe in a strong American military, but it doesn't seem to be a strong American military at all costs. And it doesn't seem like he wants to be involved in every little thing that's going on overseas. So ultimately, if we look at Trump's conservative bona fides, it seems like he only fits in the values section and only in the most limited way. Because if you look at his other values, he clearly isn't all in on being anti-abortion. And you can say, well, geez, he's just doing that for political reasons. Yeah, but if you're all in, you basically say the political situation be damned. You don't see him having any issues with non-traditional marriages, and pretty much, the idea of consenting adults doing whatever they want seems to be somewhat okay with him. So he's definitely not a social conservative, but he may very well be leveraging those middle American values as his base. And so to call him a conservative of it all is hard to justify. And the only area where he does seem to have any conservatism at all falls under social conservatism, but he definitely is very, very weak there in terms of comparing it to his peers in the social conservative realm. All right. So in the comments below, is there a part of conservatism I didn't cover? Do you disagree? Do you think Trump really is a conservative? And justify it. Tell me where you came from on that. We are going to have one more video where I tell you where I actually think he falls. It'll be surprising, perhaps, now to come up with a title for that. But Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please check out my other titles. There's a lot of different things I get into. Likely something you'd be interested in, consider subscribing. And of course, if there's somebody you think would be interested in this video, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.